Hello and welcome to the 2022 Virtual Spring Lecture Series hosted by Grey Roots Museum and Archives. I'm your host, Karen Noble. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, Six Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat, Wyandot peoples, on whose traditional territories we gather and whose ancestors signed treaties with our ancestors. We recognize also the Métis and Inuit whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples. Today is the third talk of the Spring 2022 series. On Tuesday, April 26th at 1 p.m., join Peter Whitehead for Walt Disney's Ontario Connections. This final talk of the series is a live-only event taking place on Zoom. It will not be available to view online after the talk takes place. Email media@greyroots.com to register. Before we begin, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. You are welcome to submit a question in the YouTube comments. Please note you must be logged in to a YouTube account to do so. If you are watching on greyroots.com, access the YouTube page by clicking Watch on YouTube.com in the bottom right of the video player. You can also submit a question to Grey Roots through Facebook Messenger or over email to media@greyroots.com. Thank you to Zach Erb, Media and Communications Coordinator at Grey Roots, for providing technical support for the series. And now for the presentation of the day. Owen Sound, Becoming a City, 1920 through the Great Depression. This talk will remain posted to view, so if you lose your connection, have to stop watching and want to watch any part again, or tell a friend, you can still do so. Link available from greyroots.com or visit the Grey Roots Museum and Archives YouTube channel. Today's presenter, Richard Thomas, is a broadcast journalist who has lived in Owen Sound since 1986. His first book, Gashead Willie, was published in 1996 and shortlisted by the Crime Writers of Canada as one of the best first novels of the year. Since then, Thomas has written more than a dozen fiction and nonfiction books about Owen Sound and area. He has been recognized by the City of Owen Sound, the Grey County Historical Society, and the Ontario Historical Society for his heritage work. Thomas is a longtime member of the Owen Sound and North Grey Union Public Library Board and sits on Owen Sound City Council, presently in his second term. And now, welcome, Richard.
Well, thanks, Karen, for that introduction. I do appreciate it, and welcome everybody. I'll just get a little housekeeping done here and share my screen so that we're all looking at the same thing, and hopefully you can now see my slideshow up there. I did learn a couple of things after the last talk, and this time I didn't print my talk on both sides of the page so that I'm not constantly wondering whether I'm on side 2 or side 1 of the page, so that should help. At the end of the last talk, for those of you who were here, I mentioned that one of the big solutions the City of Owen Sound had for the departure of the CPR in 1912 was to become a bona fide city, to incorporate itself as a city and step away from under the skirts of Grey County, so to speak, and stand on its own. And then people would know it was serious and things were still happening in Owen Sound. So I mentioned at the close of the last talk that the Grey County Council wasn't at all happy at the prospect of losing Owen Sound. However, it began actively working to defeat the Bill of Incorporation at the provincial legislature. The opposition revolved around the provincial Good Roads Plan, which Owen Sound, as the county town, had advocated for some years earlier. Now, the way that plan worked, all of the Grey County municipalities contributed towards the construction and the upkeep of roads throughout the county. The Southampton Beacon reported, the Grey County Council showed strong hostility to the idea of the town breaking away from the county unless the separation agreement provided that it should pay the county alimony in the shape of regular contributions to the cost of county roads. As the largest municipality in Grey, Owen Sound paid a significant share of the cost of roads, and the move towards incorporation was viewed as an attempt to dodge financial responsibility to the rest of the county. At the same time, Owen Sound was upset with county politicians who refused to spend any of the roads budget within the town limit, suggesting that town roads were Owen Sound's problem. Having been Owen Sound's great rival during the 1840s to be named the county seat, Hanover's newspaper, The Post, was fairly pointed in its views, and I quote, "Owen Sound is in the throes of an agitation to take on the dignity of cityhood, and there has been a spirited discussion this past week between the baby city-to-be and the Grey County Council as to their respective status in the event of Owen Sound's ambitious dream being realized. But Owen Sound cannot eat its cake, have its cake, and eat it too. And the moment Owen Sound incorporates as a city, she should cease to be the county town of Grey. In the event the county buildings there should be sold and the money realized theretofrom used to construct new buildings in the new county town. Hanover, as the next largest town, of course, should succeed Owen Sound as the county town. What's yours is ours, and what ours is our own seems to be the motto of Owen Sound." In a special meeting, the Owen Sound Trades and Labor Council heard from Mayor Patterson and Deputy Reeves C.H. Thompson on the issue and swiftly endorsed the idea of incorporation. The Sun-Times reported, "The members saw plainly the injustice of the stand taken by certain members of the county council and will use every effort possible to effect any sinister influence that they may try to use to defeat the bill as presented to the legislature." In the end, there was little to worry about. On April 23, 1920, news came that the Private Bills Committee of the provincial legislature had passed the bill with a few amendments to address the concerns of Grey County. This involved the creation of a suburban roads committee that would include county, provincial roads leading into Owen Sound. The city would be required to pay an amount equal to the county, up to $12,000 per year, towards the construction and upkeep of the roads. It was an arrangement suitable to both sides of the issue, and it seemed that with luck, Owen Sound would be a city by June 1st of 1920. Unfortunately, the fight didn't end there. Having initially agreed to the proposal to amend the Owen Sound bill, the county delegation changed its mind and rushed back to Toronto to try and have the bill reverted to the original wording, which would force Owen Sound to pay 1/8 of the cost of all road construction in the county, regardless of the location of the roads. Owen Sound caught wind of what was happening and, following an emergency council meeting, urged Mayor Patterson to stay the course. When the mayor and his delegation arrived at Queen's Park, it soon discovered that the county delegation had managed to have the date of incorporation changed to January 1st, 1921. But with some strong politicking on the part of the city, it was soon changed back to June 1st of 1920. Now, while the Act of Incorporation named Owen Sound a city as of June 1st, July 1st of 1920 was actually the day chosen for the civic celebration of the Declaration. In her book, Growth of a County Town, Melba Croft wrote, "From 10 a.m. until long after midnight, the streets were filled with boisterous crowds. Boxing bouts, baseball matches, diving demonstrations, horse races, football, rowing matches, parades, and fireworks were part of that memorable day." Mayor Patterson chaired the early morning official ceremony at Queen's Park across from the library. The Honorable Mr. Mills MP assisted with the incorporation papers. All events led up to the moment when Lieutenant Colonel William Avery Bishop, Billy Bishop, VC, who had flown from Toronto, walked up the steps of the platform and presented the charter of the city of Owen Sound to the mayor. And there's Billy that day right there. The first baby born in Owen Sound was one of the special guests of honor at that ceremony. Eli and Jane Pickett's daughter Bertha was born on June 3rd, 1920. She was awarded a commemorative medal by the oldest citizen of Owen Sound, George Telfer, who was the son of land agent John Telfer and was born in Owen Sound on September 6th of 1844. Now, when I got in touch with Miss Pickett's family, she had just recently passed away, and they were so disappointed because she would have been so thrilled to have been acknowledged in my book and in this talk again. But that is a picture of her, and the family provided me with a picture of the medal that she was given to commemorate the being the first baby born in the city of Owen Sound. So Owen Sound had gained its independence. Many hoped its new status would help to heal the decade-old wound caused by the departure of the CPR and usher in a new era of prosperity and happiness on the shores of Georgian Bay. In 1921, the city was abuzz with the creation of the first branch of the Canadian Legion in Owen Sound. More than 200 soldiers attended a meeting at the Savoy Theatre to hear an address on the aims and objectives of the new organization. On the heels of that meeting, the final Owen Sounder returned home after a 5-year absence. David Lusk of 14th Street West had gone overseas with the 147th Battalion in 1916. In 1918, he transferred to the Air Service, and he stayed in England to pack and ship the materials of war, including airplanes and balloons. There's a saying that everything old is new again, and in the case of diseases, and more specifically their treatment, this may be true. Families at that time were dealing with diseases which have all but disappeared today: smallpox, whooping cough, diphtheria. They were forcing the quarantine of families throughout the city and the surrounding area. Drastic means were required to deal with the spread of the diseases. The medical officer of health, Dr. Gabler, ordered all school students tested for diphtheria. In one day, 27 students were sent home from Strathcona School. A further order was issued closing schools in the town from Wednesday until the following Monday. Crews were sent into each school to thoroughly disinfect everything. Smallpox was still a serious issue in the 1920s, and so was criticism of the way people handled the disease. The Sun-Times reported that there were those in the community who believed that quarantine rules had to be beefed up in order to combat the disease, but others blamed to a large extent those people, however honest their belief, who are absolutely set against preventative measures of any kind, which includes vaccination, inoculation, or any other steps that might be taken to prevent the spread of disease. And where have we heard that one before? The community was shocked in February of 1922 when fire raced through the W.T. Harris Company wholesale warehouse on 2nd Avenue East, north of 10th Street. A third-floor tenant smelled smoke and quickly sounded the alarm. Nonetheless, the entire building was in flames in less than half an hour. Firefighters were hampered by frigid temperatures, and the roar of the flames and the flying embers could be seen and heard throughout the downtown. The Sun-Times reported, when the fire was at its height, the electric wires serving a large section of the city were melted by the intense heat. The city was plunged into darkness. With the thermometer at 12 below zero, or minus 24 Celsius, the firemen found it hard to fight the flames. Lines of hose were hard to handle, and had it not been for the assistance of many volunteers, it would have been impossible to handle the 11 lines of hose that were in use. By the time the fire was out, there was only the shell of the building, which was crusted with ice 2 feet thick in places. Damage was estimated to be $250,000. It was an auspicious day in June 1922 when the Owen Sound Golf and Country Club was officially opened. Golfers from across the province traveled to Owen Sound, and George S. Lyon, a Canadian champion, drove the first ball onto the 9-hole course. News reports predicted a successful future for the course, which was close to the King's Royal Park and had easy access for people from across Ontario and Canada via the rail lines. The city was set alight in the spring of 1924 when the Owen Sound Greys won the Memorial Cup in Winnipeg. Having initially won its first game of the tournament 5-3, Owen Sound faced Calgary in the final. The teams were badly outmatched, with Owen Sound struggling to keep up. The Sun-Times reported, for 50 minutes of the 60, they were behind their own center, battling desperately to stave off the attacks of the fighting Western lads, and they succeeded. Though outclassed and outplayed, the Easterners gave a wonderful exhibition of defensive tactics, and on the head of 16-year-old Headley Smith, the Owen Sound aggregation must place the crown of victory. This young lad staved off what looked like certain defeat by his marvelous stops. 2 Calgary goals in the game were disallowed, resulting in a 2-2 tie game. Now, with its earlier victory, Owen Sound had enough accumulated goals to win the cup. When the team returned to Owen Sound, it was estimated that almost 8,000 people lined the streets between the train station and City Hall to greet the returning champions. November brought good news with the arrival of the Algoma steamship Home Smith at the new million-bushel grain elevator in the Inner Harbor. As the vessel began unloading a cargo of oats from the lakehead, many residents believed it was more than just a shipment to a new elevator. They believed it was the start of a new era of prosperity, which would at least equal that of the CPR years in Owen Sound. The Sun-Times echoed the sentiment in a special edition celebrating the occasion. What the people of the city of Owen Sound, the City Council, and the Great Lakes Elevator Company confidently believe will prove a new era of prosperity in the city of Owen Sound commenced at 9 o'clock on Friday morning. At that hour, the Algoma steamship's freighter Holmes Smith, with Captain M.A. Livingston on the bridge, tied up in front of Owen Sound's new million-bushel grain elevator, and precisely 22 minutes later, the big gray steel leg of the new grain house dipped into number 4 hatch of the grainer, and Owen Sound was officially back on the lake's grain route. A cheer rose from the hundreds gathered in a driving northwest rain as the buckets of the marine legs started to suck the golden store of oats into the elevator. A week prior to the federal election in 1926, Owen Sounders were amazed to learn that Mackenzie King and Prime Minister Arthur Meehan would both be in Owen Sound the same day. Meehan spoke to 7,000 party faithful at a rainy gathering in Harrison Park, while King gave a 3-hour address in the Grays curling rink and then went next door to the Savoy Theatre, where the overflow crowd was waiting, and he spoke for another 3 hours. One interesting story in the Sun-Times in 1927 was about the search for the Griffin, the French explorer La Salle's long-lost ship. Built in 1679, the Griffin disappeared on her maiden voyage laden with furs and trade goods. The vessel has long been the holy grail of shipwreck hunters and had been a particular passion of Owen Sound lawyer and amateur historian H.G. Harry Tucker. In their book, The Wreck of the Griffin, authors Chris Cole and Joan Forsberg pick up the story. In October 1927, Harry Tucker, a lawyer from Owen Sound, Ontario, arranged for a small party of journalists to join him at the site of a shore-bound wreck about 1.5 miles north of the Mississauga Strait Lighthouse at the extreme western end of thinly populated Manitoulin Island, the largest freshwater island in the world. Tucker was convinced that this wreckage was the remains of La Salle's Griffin. The entire party boarded the Owen Sound Transportation Company vessel Manitoulin and sailed north to adventure. Unfortunately for Tucker, he was unable to convince the assemblage that the wreck was indeed the Griffin. He pursued the Griffin and other historical stories until the end of his life, but Tucker was never able to prove the Mississauga Strait Lighthouse wreck's identity. During a massive storm in 1936, the wreck was washed off the beach without a trace, and to this day, divers have been unable to find anything remaining of it. Now, after just one season in operation, the Great Lakes Elevator Company planned to double the size of the grain elevator to a 2 million bushel facility. The company directors planned to construct the $225,000 addition in time for the fall grain season. And as if this wasn't spectacular in itself, things got better for Owen Sound in March when the Grays won the Ontario Hockey Association finals after being defeated the 2 previous years. The Sun-Times wrote, "The orange and black-clad wonders from the Georgian Bay City staged their long-expected comeback and mastered the powerful Newmarket Juniors in one of the most thrilling final series witnessed in Toronto in years." Now, ironically, the game ended in a 2-2 tie, the same as during the Memorial Cup in 1924, but an earlier victory once again gave the Grays the highest point accumulation. The team went on to the Memorial Cup and in the final faced the Port Arthur West Ends. Those Owen Sounders who chose not to wait outside the newspaper office for game scores got good news in the morning. The Owen Sound Grays last night established themselves as Canada's greatest junior hockey team. The 6-man wonder team from the shores of Georgian Bay last night won from Port Arthur West Ends in one of the most marvelous exhibitions of all-round ice talent ever witnessed in this city. 3,000 people attended the celebration in the Market Square, where members of the team were given gold watches to honor their achievements. There was bad news for the city in 1928. The Manasoo had successfully completed its first season carrying passengers and freight. She was already laid up for the winter when she was sent to Manitoulin Island on a late season freight run. Now I'm going to deviate from my narrative here for a second. 2 years ago, a team of divers discovered the wreck of the Manasoo, and I created a soundtrack to go with their footage using archival audio interview with Dr. Art Middleborough of Owen Sound, who was the last survivor of the wreck. And here it is.
I am Dr. Arthur Middleborough, and I am the last survivor from the steamer Manasoo, which sank on a cold, stormy night in September 1928. I was a medical student and worked on the Manasoo as purser in the summertime. We had gone up to Manitoulin Island for a load of cattle on the main deck, although she was a passenger ship. The passenger season was over. This was on the middle of September. We got fairly well down, and the weather got very bad with a strong southeast wind getting up to gale force. It blew so hard it blew chairs right off the deck up over the rail and overboard. I opened the door on the top deck and it blew it right off its hinges. And it blew in this gangway door, and we took the door off the dining room and spiked it up. Spiked the top half of the wooden half of the gangway, of the passenger gangway, and we'll keep the water out. And some of the crew were terrified. Some of them were very calm. As we got farther south and just off Griffiths Island, about a mile and a half, the boat listed to port into the wind and kept on slowly going over. And most of the crew, including myself, managed to clamber up along the rail. It was dark and miserable and rainy. You couldn't see very much, although there was some sky glow. I realized that the ship was going to sink, and as I saw the stern disappearing slowly, I ran down the side of the ship and dove in and headed for Griffiths Island Light. After about 25 strong strokes, I noticed a dark patch in the water to my right, and I swam over, and it was a life raft. So I climbed up on it and helped the chief engineer up on it. The captain and the passenger and an oiler were already on it, and in a few minutes the mate came along, Ozzie Long, and I helped him up on the raft. This was about 2:30 in the morning. About 4:30, the Manitoba passed us, but it was just too dark. They didn't see us. They were only about 200 yards away. Shortly after that, the wind dropped and started from the southwest, blowing us out into the bay, towards the middle of the bay. We all felt the cold very much. I just had on a suit of hatchway buttonless underwear, as I had to get up in a hurry. And we were on this raft Friday, the rest of Friday night, from 2 o'clock Friday until 4 o'clock Monday afternoon. Early on Monday, the chief engineer died, and we had to push him overboard as the raft was sinking in one corner. However, about 4 o'clock, we saw the Manitoba, and wildly flagged, and she came and put a boat out and brought us home. Out of 21 of us aboard, only 5 survived. What happened to the boat? I don't think the cattle all went to one side, as many people believe, because they were properly penned. The boat had steel stanchions on the main deck, and these were made into pens with about 10 or 15 cattle to a pen. A total of 130 cattle. They were not large cattle. And it was a dreadful night. Terrible.
So as in all shipwrecks, there was a hearing before Dominion Wreck Commissioner Captain Leander Arthur Demers, and it began the first week of October, a scant 3 weeks after the sinking of the Manasoo. In addition to the 5 survivors, many of the same people gave testimony before Demers, but the findings were much different than that of the inconclusive inquest that was held. Demers, as was his wont, placed the blame for the disaster squarely on the shoulders of the ship's officers. The finding was devastating to the crew members and to the community, ending 1928 on a sour note. Certainly many would have woken up on New Year's Day hopeful that 1929 would be a better year for the port city. Unfortunately, world events were about to take a turn which no community would escape. A March 1928 blizzard completely shut the city down, with snowplows unable to keep the streets clear. March 1929. Power was out and the train was unable to leave as the weather was so violent. As often happens in March, the storm passed within a few days and it warmed up to a point that flooding became the local concern, especially at Harrison Park, where annually massive damage was caused during the spring melt. Riverbanks eroded and washed away, as did the road to the east of Harrison Park Inn, which was completely underwater for several days. A headline in the Sun-Times gave a hint of a much bigger storm on the horizon, one that would have a lasting impact on the city. Uncertainty exists in financial world at the end of big week, it read. The first 2 days of the week in question, stock prices had dropped precipitously on both American and Canadian exchanges. The Sun-Times reported the liquidation of stocks on Tuesday by those who wish to strengthen their accounts, along with profit-taking and short selling, produced both in Montreal and Toronto a record turnover of stocks. The storm on the market came to an end just as another storm battered the winter-weary city. Telephone and telegraph lines went down under the weight of sleet, snow, and driving winds. The CPR line was washed out at Allen Park, and the afternoon train was unable to reach the city. The Sun-Times summed it up. It is to be hoped the winter of 1929 has delivered its last kick, and that a few warm days will soon remove the snow and restore the conditions which prevailed before it arrived. It was a lot like this spring, actually. There was a change in the weather, but it wasn't for the better. Just 2 days later, the biggest electrical storm in memory hit the city. Continuous thunder and lightning pounded the city, and accompanying torrential rains were so severe that the city's storm sewers were overwhelmed. The result was a torrent of floodwaters cascading down the East Hill through the 7th Street Gully. Homes along 5th Avenue East were flooded, and debris was piled in yards as the torrent made its way toward 8th Street, where it completely covered the road before emptying into the river just west of City Hall. The rains continued, and Harrison Park, which had been holding its own, was devastated, especially at the north end of the park. The Sydenham River ignored its banks and chose any path it could find through the park. The playgrounds were underwater and the roadways completely disappeared. Hard to believe, but the grain elevator was back in the news again. The other major news was a plan by the Great Lakes Elevator Company to yet again double the size of the grain elevator to a capacity of 4 million bushels, making it one of the largest facilities on the Great Lakes. A special meeting of the City Council was held where the company asked for a fixed assessment of $20,000 on the building for a period of 10 years. Council held a plebiscite and the citizens of Owen Sound approved by a margin of more than 7-1. Work would start immediately with completion of the project expected before November. By late October of 1929, there was only one news story people were following: the economy. The signs of trouble had been there, but were ignored. In his excellent book, 10 Lost Years, Barry Broadfoot wrote, "Canada was in a very vulnerable position. Despite the country's vast size, her thinly spread population numbered only about 10 million. Her revenues came from export sales, and these sales were in vulnerable commodities: grain, pulp and paper, metals. The US accounted for 40% of our export sales, and Canada counted on the Americans for vital money for expansion." On October 29, 1929, the American stock market collapsed. With Canada and much of the world so tightly tied to America's fortunes, there was a domino effect. Broadfoot wrote, "Canada's markets began to collapse. The US, to protect its own market, erected high tariff walls shouting out Canadian goods. The prairie wheat economy tottered as the $1.60 a bushel price of 1929 skidded to 38 cents in 2.5 years. By that time, even the weather had turned against us. Drought was destroying the West, and Canada, like the rest of the world, was deep in the worst depression in history. As the West End wheat went, so did the rest of Canada. Farmers stopped buying. Eastern factories closed or laid off hundreds. Construction virtually stopped. Banks no longer lent money. Instead, they called in loans. Less and less money was put into circulation, and fewer goods were produced, and more factories were shut down, and the rolls of the poor grew longer and longer, and the gloom and the despair deepened." In Owen Sound, the newspapers carried the stories of trouble at the New York and Toronto stock exchanges, but for many city residents, that must have seemed like distant events affecting other people with little or no impact locally. It didn't take long for them to realize just how wrong they were. By mid-November, the implications were beginning to hit home. In an editorial, the Daily Sun-Times stated, "Millions of dollars have been lost by small investors in this province alone in the past 2 weeks as a result of this condition. No doubt a large part of it would soon have been withdrawn from the market for the Christmas trade, but now in many houses, the stockings at the chimneys will hang very slackly, and the usual fall stimulation of business will be lacking. Not only those who actually lost cash will suffer, because their reduced buying power will mean reduced employment, and even those who had no money with which to speculate will have even lesser pay envelopes." By January 1930, Owen Sound knew it was in trouble, even though it hadn't experienced the massive layoffs some of the larger urban centers had. Here, retiring workers were no longer replaced, and layoffs occurred just 1 or 2 at a time. There was a cumulative effect, and in January, the council had a long discussion about the unemployment situation and how the city might help. In the end, City Council decided to open an employment bureau in the City Hall to support unemployed men during the winter. Each was to register at the bureau so that the residents or employers looking for workers would know where to find one. An ad a few days later from Mayor T.W. Thompson encouraged residents and unemployed men alike to take part in the new employment bureau and to help one another out. It wasn't long before Owen Sounders were being encouraged to support local industries so there would be jobs for residents. One example of this in action was McLaughlin's Week, which received the support of both the Board of Trade and the Retail Merchants Bureau. The idea was simple. Merchants would prominently feature McLaughlin's products, such as soda biscuits, so that people could buy them rather than the brands manufactured elsewhere. The end goal was to have local grocery stores carry local products, according to the Daily Sun-Times. If the merchants of Owen Sound would be loyal to their home city, they would see to it that they stock up with the goods made in their own city, for after all, they are the ones who would receive the real benefit. And it is hoped that the effort being put forth next week to popularize the McLaughlin products will be successful. While that plan did experience some success, it wasn't enough. In July, National Grocers closed its plant, throwing men out of work. By August, the alarm bells were really ringing. Unemployment had reached 30% locally, and a special meeting was called by Mayor T.W. Thompson to find a way to deal with the issue. City Council, business and industry, and the unemployed took part. everyone agreed on the idea of asking the provincial and federal governments to embark on a series of public works projects to put men back to work. One such project occurred early in 1931, when the city decided to reconstruct the 10th Street West Hill using local unemployed men. Now, in those days, the hill was a switchback traversing the hillside protected by retaining walls. The walls had fallen into disrepair, and the project was to provide 3 days a week employment to 40 men until it was completed. The community was coming together in the face of what was turning into an international disaster. More men were given work through the City Employment Bureau. 20 got half-time work in the local quarries, while 13 were given work cutting trees. The wood went to families who required it to heat their homes. The wages were 39 cents an hour per man, with preference given to men who had families that were dependent upon them. Still, the need grew. The local YWCA received a $500 grant from an Owen Sound businessman, allowing them to prepare and distribute free meals to those with the proper credentials. In its single busiest day, the YWCA served 167 hot meals to those in need. By the time the program wrapped up for the season, volunteers had served 7,498 meals during the winter of 1930-31. In total, the city paid out $49,687.41 in relief work during the same period. Muttering on the streets about the cost of the relief program and who should or shouldn't receive benefits was a constant pressure on city council members. Those who didn't require the program always second-guessed the members of council involved in its administration. It was to be an almost constant theme throughout the Depression. This unrest found more fuel when the city learned an important lesson about unskilled labor. The 10th Street project was nearing completion when torrential rain and a broken water main washed the newly and poorly constructed retaining walls down. The following year, a contractor was hired to redo all of the work. 1932 began with across-the-board wage reductions for all municipal employees, including police, firefighters, and teachers. There was a bit of good news later in the year when it was announced a ferry service run by the provincial government would be starting between Manasoo Island and Tobermory. The MS Normac could transport 66 passengers, 18 automobiles, and 200 tons of freight per trip. The other major development that year was the formation of the Owen Sound Ratepayers Association. Its purpose, it said, was not to find fault with or oppose City Council, but to be whatever assistance it could in the interest of the municipality, according to Chair A.J. Creighton. Despite that statement, at the second monthly meeting of the association, the recording secretary, Mr. W.J. Christie, stated that many complaints were being heard on the streets and among the citizens regarding what was being done, how it was being done, the cost of it, etc. And there was considerable dissatisfaction at the high cost of some of the public works. He noted the fact through the press that many officials of municipalities and corporations were illegally spending public monies and contended that what is wanted in Owen Sound is a real audit for the purpose of ascertaining the actual costs of the work being done. In other words, they thought the politicians were lining their pockets with the relief money and wanted a true accounting. Now, Christie's comments were only the start, unfortunately. Later in the meeting, George Menzies pointed out that the high cost of education was something the city could ill afford during a depression. The province was paying $14,000 of the $40,000 operating costs of the vocational school, Menzies stated, and the value obtained is not worth that much of the citizens' money. And I am in favor of closing the vocational school altogether as a measure of economy. Menzies' airing of his personal opinion was all the permission those in the meeting needed to air their own opinions about a wide range of issues. One lady suggested that kindergarten be abolished. Another man suggested night school should be canceled. And at the end of the meeting, a notice of motion was passed calling for the publication of the names of everyone on the benevolent list in the city and a reduction of the expenses of staff administering city relief. Griping about education costs and relief efforts became a recurring theme at future association meetings. In December, the Daily Sun-Times reported that the Ratepayers Association planned to run a slate of candidates in the upcoming municipal election, with a referendum on closing the vocational school or a further rollback of teachers' salaries at the top of the list. That the Depression was deepening was no longer in doubt. In his history of the Owen Sound Police, Glenn Hepburn wrote, "Another strong indicator that the Depression had arrived in Owen Sound was Chief Carson's report on the increase of transients in the city. Between January and May of 1932, 198 men were given shelter overnight in the police cells. This was a major increase as the previous year counted 173 in total. Chief Carson took a brief history of each man in order to have them on record and reported most were between the ages of 17 and 28. The city provided each man with supper and breakfast at a cost of 35 cents per man." In 1933, T.W. Thompson was returned as mayor, but before he even had a chance to convene a meeting of the new council, the Ratepayers Association was in the news again with a recommendation that all civic salaries be reduced. The motion was sponsored by D.M. Butchert and J.S. Findlay at a meeting of the association and urged that the city council be respectfully asked to fix the salaries of all civic employees without delay on a basis in line with present day conditions, and that this association pledge itself to support the members of council taking such action. It was a bold statement, but it was by no means the most explosive one at that meeting. That came when James A. Neath suggested there should be an investigation into why defeated Alderman W.R. Clendenning was allowed to sit on council while at the same time drawing a wage from the city. An immediate investigation commenced, revealing that former Alderman Wesley R. Clendenning was on the city payroll under the name of Wes Rusk, foreman of Greenwood Cemetery. With so much happening locally, it's hard to imagine room for the Depression-weary populace to show much interest in world affairs. But on January 30th, many will have read the bold headline in the Daily Sun-Times, but few could have anticipated its long-term implications. Hitler appointed Chancellor of Germany. In his book, As It Was, Owen Sound resident Ted Tizard remembered the dirty 30s. During those years, he was working as a telegrapher for the CPR. He wrote, "I well remember people being on relief, a man and his son regularly in winter pulling a child's sleigh loaded with a bag of coal to heat their house over the weekend. The city would give them a voucher for the coal. Others would get vouchers for food, clothing, fuel, etc. Men would work at Market Square, cutting and splitting wood, shoveling snow, etc., to earn their relief vouchers. Another sad sight, which I saw regularly as my duties took me to the railway station around noon each day, was men hitching rides on passenger trains to and from Toronto. These were mostly younger men who would go from town to town on a near hopeless search for work." One local resident who did that was Watson Richards, who was interviewed by Melba Croft in 1992. He'd left to look for mining work in the Timmins area, and when that didn't pan out, he and a companion decided to hitch a ride west on a freight train. He said, "We got rid of our suitcases and bought some bologna and bread and walked with the other men to a slide grade along the line. One of the guys asked if we were new to the jump, and when we said yes, one of the older men told us what to do. And we lay down beside the track and tried to rest but couldn't. This was our big adventure." A double whistle from the engine was apparently the time to go. The whistle blew and that huge engine with a string of cars was rolling towards us. We grabbed our packs and watching the others, with them we crowded to the tracks. Jumped to the front of the boxcar we'd been told and get in. With our hearts in our mouths, we watched the train get closer. There was the first opening. We grabbed the door ledge and jumped. I kicked and scrambled my way in. Realizing we were new, fellow riders coached us in all the things that could get us into trouble. If we needed food or water, we had to wait until the train stopped for water or coal, then rush to the nearest house, get what food they'd give us, and rush back to the train. Nearly everybody gave us at least a slice of bread and butter. Only a few refused. We were warned if we sat in the boxcar doorway at big centers, the railway police would pull us off, so we jumped off as the train slowed up coming into big cities. Richards made his way all the way to Vancouver, BC, which was popular with the unemployed because, as author Patricia Roy put it, it was the only city in Canada where you could starve to death before freezing to death. Hobo jungles sprouted up across the city in dumps and empty lots, with men living in shelters constructed of anything they could find or steal. Watson Richards found it to be a beautiful city offering nothing. Lucille Nickel of Owen Sound remembers the Depression years well. Her father, Frank Slater, was a successful businessman, so her family didn't feel the effects as keenly as some others. She was in grade school during the dirty 30s. There was one girl that took me to her house after school, and when I got there, I was astounded. All of the furniture was orange crates, and I didn't realize that people had that kind of thing. Even in their bedrooms, the mattresses were on the floor. 1936 was to end on a tragic note for the city. It was late in the sailing season, and the only ships still in operation were the Hibou and the Normac. The Manasoo, the Caribou, and the Manitoulin had already gone into winter quarters. The decision was made to take one last run to the North Channel to bring winter supplies to its isolated communities. All night long on November 20th, 1936, the crew worked to get the Hibou loaded. At 4 a.m. on November 21st, the Hibou steamed out of the port under the command of Captain Norman Mackay. Also on the bridge were First Mate James Agnew and Howard Allen, who was at the wheel. Captain Mackay decided to test a new compass before getting too far from home. After a few minutes running, he ordered the wheel hard to port. Allen responded, and at the same time, Mackay rang the engine room and ordered the port engine stopped. The Hibou swung sharply to port, and Mackay commented that she was turning unusually fast. Partway into the turn, the Hibou began to take on a starboard list, which was not unusual, but instead of recovering, she continued to go over. In all, 10 people escaped the sinking of the Hibou. 7 others, including Captain Norman Mackay and stewardess Iona Johnson, were not so lucky. At the start of 1937, the Sun-Times reported that the end of the year's relief list had dropped. It was, many said, a sign that things were improving. People felt optimistic for the first time in many years. Even as things were looking up for Owen Sounders, though, Western Canada was in deep trouble. Drought had hit hard, and the already difficult situation caused by the Depression became far, far worse. Families left the prairie provinces by the hundreds, most heading east to look for work or at the very least a place to live. Owen Sounders immediately formed a community committee for Western relief and began a drive to gather money and supplies. Within the city, non-perishable fruit and vegetables were collected along with $500 in cash donations. From the surrounding rural communities, farmers gave what they could, providing truckloads of locally grown produce. Potatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, pears, apples, and other fruit and vegetables were donated. 2 train carloads, one which contained more than 40 tons of potatoes, were sent west. The Royal Tour of 1939 provided some small relief from the blackness people must have felt in year 10 of the Great Depression. School Inspector J.J. Wilson announced a field trip of 1,200 children would go from Owen Sound to see the King and the Queen on their tour. A special train had been arranged with a 400-foot-long section of the parade route reserved. Arrangements were made as well by the Welfare Board to take relief children to the grand event. Cars Transport and Movers offered to donate its vehicles to the effort, outfitting its trucks to accommodate 70 children and as many adults as would attend with them. May 22, 1939 was declared a public holiday by Owen Sound City Council, and the Daily Sun-Times reported that the city was more or less deserted as everyone traveled to Toronto to try and catch a glimpse of the King and the Queen. It was the outbreak of war that consigned the Great Depression to history. In 10 lost years, one writer commented, "Anybody saying the war wasn't the end of the Depression just doesn't know what he's talking about, because it was. Somebody once said war is good because every few years it reduces the surplus population. May be true, but it sure took a lot of us off the streets and the roadways." On September 10th, Canada declared war against Germany. It was no surprise to anyone as South Africa, Australia, New Zealand had also announced their intention to uphold their responsibilities as members of the Dominion. In Owen Sound, the Armory was inundated with requests to join up, but orders hadn't yet been received from Ottawa. Names and telephone numbers were recorded so that when a medical board was set up, recruits' intake could begin immediately. The Daily Sun-Times wrote that Owen Sound will respond in just a loyal and just as a patriotic a manner that she did in 1914 and during those 4 years until 1918 is certain. Those who served their country during that war and are now classed among the veterans are anxious again to do their bit, but it will have to be in a different way than the last time, as the majority are now past military age. Canada was going to war, and Owen Sound was going with her. Few could know just how bad things would get before they started getting better. Canada and several famous Owen Sounders had played a pivotal role in the First World War. There was great expectation that they would do the same again. Few could have guessed the toll that would be exacted before the war came to an end in 1945. And that is the end of today's talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. I will just unshare my screen here if I can get it to stop for me. There we go. I'm back on.
Thanks so much, Richard. We did have a question about your title picture, the, I guess, the Depression era worker group, just if you knew anything else about that picture.
I was given that picture by a lady, and gosh, I don't have her name written down right here, and she's going to hide me next time she sees me, but it was her father and a group of men, and that was actually one of the original City of Owen Sound works crews.
There's another question. I'm curious if the Watson Richards and the Rail Riders, if that picture was taken in Owen Sound, if you knew.
Well, I'm afraid that I did do a bit of a cheat there. That wasn't actually Watson Richards. That was just a Depression era photo of someone riding the rails. I searched and searched and searched, and I'm sure that now that the book on the Depression is in print, I'll find a picture of him, because I always find these things after I need them.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But it was such a great story. I couldn't pass up putting it in.
There's a question from YouTube. Do you know if many people from Owen Sound migrated during the Depression looking for work out west?
I didn't find a lot of information about that, so I'm going to guess it wasn't a lot of people. I think that with the efforts the city was putting in, and certainly with the newspaper coverage describing the fact that it was just as bad everywhere, probably many didn't go. And typically, as with Watson Richards, it was the young men who went, because many of the relief programs, including the one here in Owen Sound, favored those with families to support, and young men were just kind of left on their own to catch as catch can when it came to survival.
Great. There's another question. Just curious if there were any other construction projects during the era besides the 10th Street West Hill project.
Oh yes, there were quite a few projects. Sewer lines were replaced and road work was done, and it was pretty much ongoing, but they didn't ever try anything the scope of the 10th Street Hill project with unskilled labor again. They learned their lesson from that one.
Or small projects. And there's just a question about your resources. If you've produced other local historical videos similar to the Manasoo, and where they might be available.
Well, yes. In fact, I do have a YouTube page, and it's not under my name though. It's under RT Communications. If people want to look, and I've got over 100 local historical videos, news stories, and bits of film and things on that website. Stuff that catches my fancy. I do have a massive video and film archive of historical stuff, but just not enough time to get it all up there. As well, I do have a Vimeo site, and if you go to my Vimeo site, which is, I believe, under Richard Thomas Communications, there are, I've done a number of stories. I did a video on the sinking of the Hibou. I did an interesting story with the late Andrew Armitage about the search for the girl with the blue eyes, the haunted courthouse, a whole series of local things.
Oh yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. And then there's some broad questions. Just if you had any research tips if someone's interested in pursuing a local history project.
Well, actually, it's become very interesting lately because for some years now, I've been using an online site called newspapers.com, but up until about 6 months ago, the Owen Sound newspapers weren't on there, but now they are. So if you want to do local research, pony up your $70 and go to newspapers.com. And in fact, you might want to check with the public library because they may actually have a subscription over there. But the beauty of that, as opposed to the painstaking search through the microfilm, is that it's all searchable by keywords. And so it's very easy to come up very quickly with a large amount of research material if it was covered by the local newspapers.
Great.
In fact, that's how I spent my COVID lockdown. I now have 2 books in the hopper and at least one more that I'm thinking of writing because I've done all the research, because it's so addictive getting into those archives.
That actually leads to the next question, which is what projects or books are you working on now?
Well, I'm hoping to have a book out by the end of the summer, and I haven't titled it yet, but it'll be something in the line of Incredible Owen Sounders or Amazing Owen Sounders. And this is really a collection of biographies of people that you may not have ever heard of from Owen Sound, but who went out there in the world and did just amazing things. And I've come across them through all the various different areas of research and just decided I would collect them all in one book because they all interest me. And so I always think if I'm interested, probably somebody else will be interested as well. And out of that sprung another project, and you can see a movie poster right above me here, and starring Big Game Hunting in the Arctic, starring Harry Whitney and Lucky Scott. And Lucky Scott was an Owen Sounder. And so he gets his own book because his life was so amazing. And I have 2 3-inch binders filled with printed news stories about Lucky Scott from all over the world. And he really just did go everywhere. So I'm very excited about writing that story when I find the time.
Well, thanks again, Richard. Really enjoyed your talk. And yeah, definitely recommend if anyone wants to check out more videos, RT Communications YouTube channel has more, even modern day, the 80s on there as well. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.